Chapter 8 Safe Havens. Better known than the enigmatic City of Shadows was Ith's Council House, also called Mero's Citadel, or the Magician's Conclave. At a time when all the rest of the world was plunged into darkness and ignorance, the Conclave served as a beacon of magical thought. Here was the home of Ith, and Mersel, and Barl, and Shannon, and a host of other names that are invoked by mages to this day. Here was the true flowering of magic, where the persecuted spellcasters could find a place to work, to research, and to study. And they came from all over Terisier to benefit from this magical renaissance. Arkal, Argivian scholar. Jota awoke, spitting sand out of his mouth. He opened his eyes and saw a screaming gull wheel high in the air over him. Apparently, it was sizing him up as a refuse, and disappointed that he proved to still be alive. The young man pulled himself to a sitting position. Every joint in his body complained from the effort, and his flesh felt as if he had been battered by a gang of assailants and then left to die. Then, he saw the waves breaking down the beach, a long tidal flat between him and the combers. He remembered what had happened. The ship, the storm, and Seema. A cold fury gripped his stomach. Seema had abandoned him. She could have saved him, and she had not. She rescued the mirror, and not him. The gull screamed again, and Jota looked out over the ocean. It was a slate gray now, almost merging with the sky in a single overcast expanse, rolling out to the horizon, and then rolling back over his head. Seema had not saved him, but he had somehow survived, and now Seema was probably dead, along with the captain and his elven mate, and likely anyone else on board the ship, like Mother Dobbs, like Fendal, and the other soldiers, both Elsurian and Ged, at Pitdown, like Voska. The gull settled down above the waterline to contest some of the surf-deposited object with a black-headed turn. Jota rose slowly, his joints still ringing from the movement, his flesh feeling like heavy clothing. He shooed the birds away, hoping that perhaps they fought over some clue to the fate of the others. What they had been fighting over was the decaying corpse of a fish, a long, slender eel that had been pulled from his deep-water home in the storm and dashed on alien shores. Just a bit of flotsam, like himself. Jota stripped and bathed in the surf, the cold water bracing his skin and anesthesiaing the pain in his joints. He dusted the bulk of his sand out of his clothing and dressed again, all too aware that he would be feeling bits of grit beneath his shirt and pants for days. He replaced the heavy boots, and for a moment had a vision of them filling with water, dragging him down beneath the stormy waves. Had he survived by miracle or by magic? He wondered. Did it truly matter? The rest had died, and he had lived, and what was the point of wondering why that was so? Seema would have provided a reason, easily and effortlessly, but she was dead. That did not make the ache of her betrayal any less. When Jota turned back and toward the inland, he saw the ragged figure in torn scraps and tatters, standing on the dune, a lantern in one hand and a satchel in the other. The sea breeze caught the ends of the figure's robes and bandages and turned them into dark pennants against the cold gray sky. Jota blinked, and the ragged man did not disappear. The tattered creature did, however, turn away and descended the far side of the dune. Jota shouted and began running. Running in the loose sand above the tide line would be slow going under the best of circumstances, and it was more difficult both by exhausted muscles and heavy boots. When Jota crested the first line of dunes, the ragged figure was gone. No, his quarry was a few hundred yards away, on the other side of a low marsh of sea oats, standing on a second line of dunes. Again, the figure turned and disappeared slowly as Jota ran forward. The footing was better along the clumps of yellow-brown weeds, and he reached the top of the inner line of dunes, scanning the horizon for the mysterious figure. Inland of the second line of dunes was a meadow overrun with purplish flowers. At the far end was another low hillock, this one carved with a perfectly round opening of a burrow, about the size of a man. The ragged creature was standing next to the entrance of this cave, and, as Jota spotted him, the figure turned and walked inside. As Jota neared the entrance, the burrow itself was lit from within by a pale, reddish light. Jota slowed and carefully approached the entrance. Within was a small cave, running no more than 20 feet back into the low hill, with sloping walls like a tunnel. There was space to stand in the center, and the sides had low rows of packed earth fashioned like benches. The ragged figure released the lantern and raised his arm. Something glowed a sickly white in his hand, a wan companion to the warm crimson shades of the lantern. As Jota entered, the figure dropped the bone-white stick and crushed it firmly beneath his heel. "Who are you?" said Jota. The ragged figure went to the far wall and sat on the earthen bench. "I said, who are you?" repeated Jota. The figure pointed to a similar earthen bench on the opposite wall. Jota entered the small cavern warily. If he had a weapon, Jota would have bared it. Even now, he regretted not pausing to grab a chunk of driftwood. 3, maybe 4 times you've shown up in my life. Always when there's trouble. What are you? A ghost? A dream? A trick of the light?" ranted Jota. The ragged figure said nothing, but maintained his pose on the earthen bench, thin blue-tinged hands clasping his knees. Jota crossed the cavern in a rush. "Why don't you answer me?" he shouted. Jota intended to reach up and rip the rags covering the creature's face, to tear back the cowl and reveal the features beneath. Part of him thought he might know the face if he saw it. Part of him thought there would only be a skull beneath the robes. And part of him thought his hand would pass through the robes, rags, cowl, and all, and the ragged figure would fade from view like a fevered dream unmasked. Jota did not even see the creature move. Suddenly, one thin hand raised from its position on the creature's knees and grasped Jota's hand firmly around the wrist. Jota's fingers mere inches from the cowl. Jota felt icy cold from the fingers reach up from his arm, but his wrist was locked in an unyielding grip. The ragged creature twisted his arm slightly, and Jota's entire body twisted to the left, following the motion of his trapped hand. There was a momentary pause, and the intense grip lessened, apparently to give Jota the chance to pull away, to flee. Instead, Jota tried to swing his body around and grab the ragged figure with his other hand. Again, the ragged man was too fast for him. His opponent redoubled his grip on Jota's wrist and brought the trapped wrist forward, and then down, and then flung it, and the body it was attached to across the room. Jota slid across the earthen floor of the cave and smashed into the far bench. Jota slowly picked himself up off the floor. The tattered figure motioned to the bench, then raised a single finger to the unseen covered mouth. "Sit down and shut up," said Jota, more to himself than to his companion in the cavern. "I think I get the message." The ragged figure said nothing. Jota pulled himself up on the earthen bench and regarded the tattered figure. His companion in the cave was covered head to toe in ragged bandages, even beneath its robe and cowl. The ragged being's fingers were bare, but they were no more long than whitish talons, little more than spurs of bone. Was this thing human? Was he magical? One thing for certain, Jota thought, rubbing his sore shoulder, he wasn't a dream, and he wasn't a trick of the light. For the moment, that discovery seemed to be enough. The ragged figure sat immobile, across the earthen burrow, on a bench of packed earth, skeletal hands on his knees. Jota watched, one foot raised on his own bench, his back against the soft earth of the cave wall, waiting for the ragged rat being to take any action. The only movement in the cave was the flickering of the wick flame in the lantern by the ragged creature's side, and their own shadows following that flickering, locked in a tight and exact dance. After 15 minutes, Jota felt drowsy. After 20, he realized that he should be anywhere else but in a burrow with some inhuman creature. After 25 minutes, he realized that the tattered human thing across from him could have killed him 3 or 4 times over, but so far only provided help. The thing had been his dark guardian angel. After 30 minutes, Jota was asleep. His head dropped to his chest, snoring softly. Across from him, the ragman waited. Jota awoke at the ragman's first movement. The creature of rags and tatters stood up, his slumped shoulders barely grazing the interior curve of the cave. Jota's eyes were open at once, and he brought up his hands immediately to put them between himself and the tattered black figure. The ragged creature merely hunched over and picked up the lantern by its oversized loop. He walked to the entrance of the small cave, turned back slightly, as if to invite Jota to follow, then left. The light went into the ragged man, and Jota followed. The air was odd. It was colder than before, in a world where everything seemed to be either cold or colder, and the smell was wrong. The smells of the ocean, of salt and things dying on the beach was missing. Instead, there was a cold, sharp tang, carrying just a hint of distant smoke. Jota reached the entrance of the cavern and saw that he was now very far from the beach. The cavern entrance was not on the side of some purple-flowered hillock, but instead carved into the side of a great black mountain. Steps, worn by the passing of many feet, led down from the dark hillside. Ahead of him, the ragged figure walked down the stairs, holding his lantern, ahead to guide his path. Jota shook his head. He looked back into the cave. It was one that he had entered before, the one by the beach, yet now it opened out to a completely different part of the world. Seema had talked of magic having flavors, taste, and smell. This definitely had the feel of magic, and it had a smell, one that Jota could not put his finger on. Jota turned and followed the descending lantern light, finding his footing in the dying light of the day. The sky was red, with sunset to his right, and the shoulder of the black mountain cast a shadow that consumed him and his guide. Ahead of them, across a low, flat plain, was another shoulder of the mountain, thrust out and farther away from its parent. On that outthrust shoulder was a great castle. Castle, yes, though a large one, larger than most towns, with a huge central keep and numerous towers. The towers were tipped by ornate ironwork frames that looked very much like a collection of holy symbols welded together at random. Equally ornate balconies with iron railings dotted the towers. Flying bridges and curved battlements spanned the spaces between the towers and the central keep. In the waning light, Jota could see the complex sprawled out and downward over most of the mountain's shoulder. Portions of the great building hung over the cliffs beyond, suspended by buttresses, and it would seem, aided by spells and wishful thinking. For its part, the central keep was dominated by an ever higher set of peach roofs, some of thatch and wood shingles, and some of multicolored slate that caught the last glimmers of the evening light. There were lights in some of the upper windows, and even from the distance, Jota could hear the sound of people laughing. Jota caught up with his ragged guide, who was moving slowly and methodically across the plain. At first, Jota thought that the patch of land they were crossing was some type of abandoned garden, like the ones he knew in Giva province, given up to rot and weeds. There were low walls everywhere, overgrown with dark ivy and glory plants. The glory plants had withdrawn their flowers with the loss of the light and would bloom again only in the morning. The walls were tumbled and decayed and snaked in all directions. A labyrinth, Jota realized. It was like a garden maze, built in front of a manor house, but this one was huge and had been abandoned. No, he corrected himself. It had never been finished in the first place. Someone intended to fill the plain with a great maze and had stopped halfway through the process. His guide moved silently. Was this castle the place of the creature's master? Jota wondered. Or was it his angel merely guiding him to a safe haven? He followed the ragged creature cautiously. The evening light had faded entirely behind them as they neared the causeway to the castle's main gate. As Jota watched, small fires appeared along the lines of the battlements, but there was no sign of movement along those walls. The lanky, hunched figure stopped and set the lantern on the ground at Jota's feet. The figure pointed at the main gate. "You're not coming with me?" said Jota, his brows lowered in concern. The ragged figure placed both hands over the center of his chest, palms inward. Then he raised a finger to his hidden mouth. Jota nodded. "You don't want them to know about you," he said. "But is it safe there?" The ragged figure did not respond, but was moving off, back to the unfinished labyrinth. "I asked." "Hey!" said Jota, and bent down to grasp the brass lantern. When he rose again, lantern in hand, the ragged figure was gone. Jota muttered a curse under his breath and looked at the causeway. He had no weapons, no food, and no idea where he was. The only way to go was forward. He crossed the causeway and rapped hard on the main gate with the fleshy part of his palm. The door thundered under his knocking. The great gate itself was made of two halves, so that when it fully opened, a full-sized giant could stride through without stopping. On one half of the gate was a smaller door, and in that door, there was a slot covered by a sliding piece of wood. The piece of wood slipped open with a resounding clack, and Jota walked over to it. "Who are you?" said a voice on the far side of the door. It sounded bored and disinterested. "I am Jota," said the young man simply. "Where am I?" The voice on the far side ignored him. "Why are you here?" Jota took a deep breath and said, "I seek a safe and warm place. Would you turn away a tired traveler?" The voice said, "Are you a wizard?" Jota looked at the eyes on the other side of the slot and thought of the church. "I don't know if I want to tell you that," he said. There was a chortle. "Well?" When you decide you are, Sonny, you be sure to knock again. I'll be here all night." And with that, the shutter of wood clattered shut with a final click. Jota stared at the door and carefully counted to 10. Then he counted a second time. The third time, he started at 10 and worked backward. Then, he took a deep breath and cleared his mind. The path for the spell was now and well worn as the steps leading down the mountain, and he did not need to fully think of it as he called it from the depths of his memory. He knocked on the small door with one hand and placed the other palm outward on the small sliding shutter. Nothing happened. He knocked a second time. "You still here?" said the peed voice on the other side, sliding the shutter open. There was a shout of surprise as Jota unleashed the blast of light in the doorkeeper's face. The main portion of the light was white, but Jota had included small streamers and balls of green, red, ebony, and blue radiance as well. "I thought about it," said Jota to the door, "and I suppose I am a wizard after all." A weak voice answered from behind the shutter. "Then enter, friend wizard." There was a pause, and the voice added, "I'll open the gate for you, as soon as I could see well enough to find the door handle." In his luxurious study, Lord Mayorsol hunched down before his clockwork creation. It was too wide to put on a shelf, and just tall enough to make putting it on a workbench unfeasible. He would have to have the servants build a special low table for it, eventually, but for the moment, he had a greater problem with it than just aesthetics. He ran a long, elegant finger over one set of cogs, then another set, tracing the motion of the clockworks from one set of gears to another. The gears were not made of metals, but of minerals and stone. The largest wheels were slate and marble, the ones that were smaller were made of quartz and mica, and the smallest and most vital pieces of the devices were carved from rubies and sapphires. One small rune-covered plate, near the heart of the construct, had been fashioned of rare and perfect obsidianus, and others were made of platinum, rustbane, and water silver. He tapped one particular cog and nodded, then went to his workbench, bringing back the smallest of the hourglasses. He turned the hourglass over as he passed his hand over the rune-carved gem on the clockwork itself. The clockwork sprang to life, its gears and cogs glowing of their own radiance. The tie rods of graphite spun in time, and the golden cords hummed through jasper pulleys. Within the dim light of the study, the gems bathed Lord Mayorsol in an ever-changing glow. Lord Mayorsol paid no notice. Instead, he was lost in thought, idly twisting the ruby ring on his right hand. The last of the sands of the small glass ran out, and as it passed through the narrow neck of the timepiece, Mayorsol reached his hand out. He touched the rune-inscribed gem, just as the bit of white sand joined its fellow at the base of the glass. There was a soft, firm rap on the door jamb of his study.
"The calendar is fast,"
said Mayorsol, looking up.
"My lord mage,"
said the stocky figure at the doorway. Barl, chief artificer of the conclave, entered the room. He was the only member of the citadel who would dare to knock on Mayorsol's door when he was involved in an experiment.
"I said, the calendar is fast,"
said the master of the conclave, rising from his crouched position.
"Have it take over 15 minutes. Expand that out to weeks, months, even years, and that is intolerable."
Barl let out the sigh of a man who heard this type of news before.
"I will check the parts,"
Mayorsol interrupted.
"It's the jadeite cog, the third smallest of the set. It is wearing too fast. Replace it with one made of nephrite."
"Your words become my deeds."
"As always,"
said Mayorsol.
"Why have you come?"
"A potential initiate."
"It's late for new arrivals. They normally arrive with supply caravans and the like. Any ability?"
"Likely,"
said the artificer.
He blinded the doorman with a flash of light.
A smile gently grew across Mayorsol's face.
"Indeed? Industrious sort."
"You wish to be notified. Handle him as normal?"
"Yes," said Mayorsol, looking back at the clockwork in front of him.
"Interview and audition. Find out if he has any magics on him, or if he knows where to find them. Then give him something challenging. I think,"
he looked at the stocky man,
"I think it would be a good thing to bring out one of the old toys. Yes, if he's using light, he's likely a wight. Then one of the old toys would be best for him."
Barl bowed and touched a hand to his wide forehead.
"As you wish." my lord.
Send a runner for me for the audition,
said Marisol, absent-mindedly.
I feel the need for a little diversion coming on.
Barl gave a solemn grin.
Of course, my lord mage.
He turned to go. And Barl.
Yes, my lord mage?
You didn't carve the jade cog yourself, did you?
Barl paused, then said,
No, my lord mage. A student of mine did. He is a promising student, and I thought he could handle it.
Marisol nodded.
The promise is unfulfilled. Tell him that I am displeased, and break 2 of his fingers as punishment. On the left hand, of course.
Barl paused again, then said,
Of course, my lord mage. Your words are my deeds as ever.
I thought it was lesser work,
said Marisol.
I can always tell when one of the apprentices does it. Sloppy. Hopefully your next apprentice will be more careful in such matters.
Yes, my lord mage.
Barl was gone. Marisol knelt down again next to the gemstone calendar. With one hand, he flipped the hourglass, and with the other, he touched the rune gem that brought the device to life. He leaned back as the magical colors played out of his lean face, and he twisted his ruby ring as he watched both the device and the hourglass. Deep beneath the castle, Ith fought the darkness and his own madness. He could feel the darkness surging from beneath him and from the depths of the pit. The pit had predated the citadel, and indeed likely predated the monastery that once stood there. The pit was eternal, and from the pit rose the darkness that clawed at his thoughts. Hideous creatures thrived in that darkness. Sometimes he envisioned the thought creatures as being great jellyfish, rising like balloons from the depths of the pit, trailing poisonous tendrils made of spun gold. Sometimes there were spectral dragons the size of bats. Sometimes there were skeletal bats the size of dragons. Sometimes there were gremlins with pitchforks. Always, they called to him. Always, they entreated him. Always, they tempted him. They could free him, if he would only free them. He was there as a lens of power, magnifying Marisol the Pretender's abilities, swelling the usurper's source of mana. But he was also a gate, a doorway between the real world and the things that lived within the pit, or beyond the pit. He dreamed of a man made of wires and bone, with snakes growing from the back of his head. The wire man whispered horrible truths about Marisol, about the conclave, about the ever-darkening world. When Ith awoke, he knew it to be more than a dream, but he was unsure if he awakened to his life or only to another dream. Then, he began screaming, and the madness took hold of him for a long time. The madness seemed to be a bulwark against the dark, but he needed to be sane. At least he thought he needed to be sane. On occasion, the water silver in his bars would glimmer with power as Marisol pulled more of Ith's energy upward to be harnessed in the usurper's spells and devices, and in doing so, he weakened the wall against the things in the pit even more. Ith felt a scream rise within him, and he fought that as well as the temptation of the darkness. He tried to maintain his grip on the real world, but he had forgotten why doing such a thing was important. It was what he had always done, and so he continued. Something in the real world moved, the movement of soft cloth against stone. Like a swimmer seeking fresh air, his lungs bursting, Ith forced his mind through the black waters around him, and finally emerged into the real world. He was back in his water silver cage, back in the safe blackness of reality, and he was not alone. His servant stood on the edge of the abyss. Had the ragman been there long, or had he just arrived? Had Ith not just sent him away that last time? Had he gone away? Ith could no longer tell. Ith's voice rasped in the darkness. You are back. The ragman bowed slightly at his master's voice. You have brought aid? Said Ith, his hands wrapped around the bar. Even the touch caused the water silver to glow. Again, the ragman bowed. Where is it? Said Ith. The ragman held up both hands, skeletal and empty. Then, he pointed above, to the lands where Marisol had taken its place at the head of the council, where the wine ran free and the mages wasted their talents at fripperies. Salvation lay above him. It was not here yet. So close, and yet so far away. Ith nodded wearily and slumped back into his cage. In the back of his mind, he thought he heard the rich laughter of the creatures from the pit. For the first time, Ith was tempted to join them. He felt the madness and the darkness claw at him. So, he said in a throaty chuckle. It begins.